everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon session. I am incredibly excited for this conversation and really delighted to welcome this panel discussion with these four incredible, esteemed folks. We could spend most of this time just talking about their work and their accomplishments, but I'm not going to do that because you want to hear from them. I'll give a brief introduction to who will be joining us today. And then we're going to move on so you can really hear from these amazing women. So first, Cheryl Morrison-Deutsch is president and CEO of a digital health company and champions the need to address the intersection of physical and mental health. Cheryl's committed to leveraging technology, an area of expertise for her, so that folks can get physical health support and overall well-being in more accessible ways. Gigi Sagansky is a published writer, DJ, and host of Driven Minds, a podcast which sparks complex conversations about mental health. I highly recommend listening to it. It is really thought-provoking. Gigi has an international listening audience, which really allows her to expand the reach to really challenge stigma around mental health. Diane Patrick has led a lifelong distinguished career, which includes advocacy for mental health and for marginalized communities through her work as an attorney and educator, and has spearheaded policy through her public service and numerous prominent leadership roles. And Michelle Walker is a senior executive in finance and a pioneering leader in the movement to address suicide prevention in the construction industry. Michelle is a founding member of the Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention. So welcome all of you. As we know, the past 2 years have shown us that leadership within organizations and communities has a direct impact on the well-being of employees and community members. We know that businesses have thrived or failed based on how leadership showed up in the short term or the long term during this time. And as we've talked to leaders at MindWise, through MindWise over the last 2 years, what we've heard from many decision makers is that the last 2 years have forced them to be better leaders in terms of being more attuned, engaged, empathic, and decisive. So each of you in your roles leads either in the workplace, organizations, in your communities, however you define your communities. So we're here to talk about what brought you to the work, what you could share that would be valuable to those that are joining us. And it really is a privilege to have you here today. So thank you. I have no doubt this is going to be a lively conversation. So I would like to start just by asking each of you to introduce yourselves, tell a bit about your story, what brought you to this work. Why are you doing what you're doing?
Well, I can go first, unless you want to.
Great, Diane.
Someone. Okay. No. Anyway, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this really important discussion. I think it's, well, I think everybody here is here because they know how critical it is. I became committed sort of accidentally to the cause of erasing the stigma associated with mental health. And the accident is that, for many, many years, I mean, decades ago, I realized that I needed some help and support, but I never really acknowledged it out loud, not to myself, not to my family, not to my community or anyone else, because it was not something that one ever talked about. Particularly in the Black community in which I grew up, that was weakness. And mental health support was only for, wealthy white people. I mean, to just put it bluntly, and you didn't want to show a sign of weakness. Moreover, there wasn't going to be any money to help in any event. So I never sought help well into my adulthood, even though as I knew I needed it. And then, in somewhat of a perverse turn of and life-changing event, my mental health issues became a matter of public knowledge, widespread public knowledge, because I, for those of you who may not know, was First Lady of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts when I came crashing down and needed help, and it was a real cry for help. And I had to step away not only from my full-time practice of law at a firm here in Massachusetts, a pretty prominent firm, but also from my duties as First Lady. I was trying to manage both of those at the same time. And I think that was, a large part of what finally was the trigger. And all of a sudden, I found myself in the public eye dealing with something that I had hidden from myself for 40, 50 years. And I realized at that time, once I was well and was strong again, and learned from how much I was suffering and had suffered because of the silence and the stigma, I was determined to try to bring this out into the open. And so in ways that are probably not quite as prominent as those of my fellow panelists, I began to speak out in small groups, in public settings, in communities of color, and here. And so that's why I'm here, and that's how I got here.
Thank you, Diane. I can tell you, living and working in Massachusetts, what you went through and that visibility was incredibly powerful and really helped many people to be able to come forward and get help themselves. So thank you.
May I
for
just
sharing
add
that.
to that, because I think it's an important thing to add, something that you just said prompted this. I don't know, probably 1,000 letters and emails I got from people throughout the Commonwealth saying just that thank you, the fact that you were able to acknowledge what happened to you has allowed me to tell my boss, my husband, my children, my partner, what have you. And so that it's a continuing reinforcement
Yes.
of the fact that speaking about it just liberates people to take care of themselves.
Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely. So Cheryl, would you like to? Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, thank you as well, being on this panel with this wonderful group of women and being able to have this conversation is a delight and an honor. So thank you for having me here. I've spent the majority of my career at the intersection of healthcare and technology. I came to Zillion about 6 years ago because they had a platform that allowed the patient, or we call them the member, to be in the driver's seat and to empower them to be an advocate for their own health. At the time, we had primarily focused on metabolic disorders and chronic conditions. But in March of 2020, as you all know, the world changed. And we actually had a front row seat. We had coaches in thousands of homes working with people and saw the immediate effects of the pandemic and the effect that it had on individuals' mental health. And I believed at the time we had a platform that could do something to help those that were struggling, that we could be in people's homes, help them see that they weren't alone, and be a point of contact at a time that was very isolating for people. But I believed that we could change that, and we could use our platform to help those that were struggling. You see, part of that is because I have a very personal interest in changing that conversation around mental health, and in particular, the conversation around suicide prevention. Back in 2012, my community, and very specifically my family, lost a beautiful young girl to suicide. She was my daughter's best friend. She was someone who was special to my entire family. She was only 13 years old, and her name was Isabel. Her loss changed my life and the life of countless others around her. As we all recovered from the grief, and truly, I don't know that you ever fully recover from the grief, but as we all processed the grief, I developed a new purpose and passion. And that was really for around removing the stigma around the conversations around suicide, especially at the time between teens and tweens and their parents. We needed to open up that conversation and let kids know they weren't alone. They could seek help. They could talk to their parents. And it was really also important for the parents to understand that there was no shame in getting help for their children, that it was okay to reach out, and that mental and physical health were very much the same. And you can't really have one without the other. That passion has led me, again, through the pandemic, to realize that the conversation isn't just with your teens and your tweens. You have to be able to have this conversation in the workplace. we developed a program called Restore Resilience to support employees who are really going through some of these issues, some of the trauma, some of the isolation. Originally for the pandemic, but we realized it's not just about the pandemic. It's about every day. That's why I do the work that I do at Zillion. That's why I'm proud to be part of that organization that values mental health the same as we value physical health, both internally as a company, but also for our customers.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you. And thank you for sharing the story about your experience of loss to suicide with someone close by. It's such a reminder to me every time I hear one of these stories that we are all truly 1 degree away from having experienced loss by suicide to someone very close to us, as well as mental health struggles, which, as you just said, are as common as physical health issues. So thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Michelle, I'm just following my screen. Michelle.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. Again, like everybody has said, proud to be a part of this esteemed group of women. So I am definitely not, I kind of happened into this by accident as well. So my profession formally is accounting and finance. I work for a construction company. I've worked in construction my entire career and really grew up in construction. My dad was a general contractor, and so it's an industry that is near and dear to my heart. I ended up beginning to work in this field about 6 years ago when it was brought to a construction group that I'm a part of, that the construction workforce seemed to be at an increased risk of suicide. And at that time, it was all very kind of anecdotal and not a lot of kind of hard statistics. But as we explored the issue and I learned more about it, what kind of sucked me in was, like I think for many, that lived experience. So when I was in high school, again, growing up the daughter of a contractor, and I grew up in a small oil town, very blue collar, my dad's best friend died by suicide. And I watched the struggle that my dad had with trying to mourn and grieve the loss of his friend, while nobody would call it what it was. And nobody would say suicide. Nobody would say that he killed himself. It was a shooting accident. And the struggle that my dad had with almost it being a secret swept under the rug, the inability to really properly even process that grief when it was so clearly there was such this attitude of shame associated with it that you couldn't even talk about how it happened. So it was best just to kind of not talk about it at all. And so here I was 25 years later and hearing about the industry that I've been, a part of basically my whole life, and hearing, these stories of people who have died by suicide, and it kind of almost a bit of an epidemic when you started thinking about the risk factors and why it was happening in construction. I realized I heard some of these exact same things that I had experienced when we had experienced this loss of my dad's friend, so many years ago. Nobody wanted to talk about it. You couldn't say exactly what happened, kind of sweep it under the rug, don't talk about it, pretend it never happened, not honoring, the people who were lost, none of this stuff. And so that kind of really got me hooked. I thought, I can't believe this is nothing, we haven't moved the needle at all on this in all of this time. And so I got engaged with kind of this little grassroots effort in construction to kind of just look at it and address it. And we started our efforts in 2016 by hosting a suicide prevention summit in Phoenix, Arizona. And we brought together suicide prevention, mental health experts with the construction industry, along with kind of local resources that just to kind of educate the industry that this was happening, and just really start to build kind of their awareness of not just the issue in the industry, but just kind of the topic of mental health in general. And that has evolved, over the time into formally creating the Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention. which started kind of as a committee of another association and then has grown into its own a standalone entity. And along the way, supported by new formal studies from the CDC, you know, the suicide deaths ranked by industry and occupation, which elevated our industry to the most at risk for suicide. So like I said, when we started, we just thought it was at kind of an increased risk, and now it's been demonstrated that it's at a high risk. And so working to build kind of our target audience is the leaders in the construction industry, the business leaders, union leaders, people who can be in a position to provide the resources to the people that need them and to build some best practices into their businesses to start to turn the tide on that statistic.
Thank you, Michelle. It really is an example of how in the suicide industry through CISP, it's been very much integrating those resources, integrating the trainings into the workforce, which I think is such a great example. And that there's an openness in construction to really tackling this. So thank you. And Gigi.
Again, as everyone said, thank you for having me. Talking about mental health is my favorite thing to do in the entire world, which is why I've made it my career. I host Driven Minds, as Lisa said, in partnership with Porsche. So that's right, a car company hosts a mental health podcast, and I think that that is a sign as to where this area is headed. And I think it's only headed to a place of bright and new frontiers. Similar to Diane, whose story really resonated with me, my own personal journey brought me here. When I was 9, I was diagnosed with ADD, and the Ritalin and all the stimulants brought out OCD. So by the time I was 11, I was on a slew of antipsychotics and SSRIs. Nothing was really working for me. And I think most importantly, I was convinced my brain was broken because we tack on these words like disability and disorder, right? Learning disability, attention deficit disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. So I showed up into the world thinking I was broken. And I went off all meds around when I was 22, when I realized that none of it was working for me. But I never dealt with the OCD or even went to therapy. So I basically lived in a lot of pain, but I also was reaching my personal goals. I was an editor at Vogue and W, and I DJ'd for different brands around the world like LVMH. And, you know, I held on to all the success I was having as a signifier that I didn't have issues and I didn't really have to deal with my problems. And of course, this all creeped up on me and culminated when I was 30. And I reached a breaking point and I checked into McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts for OCD. And I spent 3 months in the psychiatric ward dealing with my OCD. And I still never went on meds. I did mindfulness and worked with a therapist every day. And that really changed my life. And I think also what's really worth noting is I'd never breathed a word of my story, my OCD, anything to anyone. And I had a lot of shame. I mean, the shame was just boundless and just ate me alive. Because I still thought of myself as like fucked up, because that's what the world was telling me. And a girlfriend of mine invited me onto her podcast to tell my story. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it because shame thrives in secrecy. We all learned that from Brene Brown. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to go onto the show. I'm going to tell my story. And just for me, right? To get this out of me, let it out into the world. And I did that. And it was a live audience recording. And the most incredible thing happened, which was after the recording, I had a line of people waiting to talk to me about mental health. And I was just like, I'm not a therapist. Why do they want to talk to me? Right. And I got a slew of emails after, tons of Instagram messages. And I was just like, okay, this is a huge epidemic. Everyone needs help and no one is talking about it. So that kind of led me to start my podcast. And again, I pitched it to a car company and explained that this is the epidemic of my generation. And everyone has to get on board because we are collectively going through this, and it just was amplified by COVID. So that's what led me to where I am today.
Thank you, Gigi. Every time I hear your story, I'm just equally riveted by it. And thank you for calling out the shame and secrecy, because we also know then that kind of perpetuates a stigma because it shuts down conversations. So I want to mention something I realized I did not at the beginning of this panel, which is that the way we're going to structure it is have the conversation. I'm going to throw out questions. All of you will discuss and share your thoughts and viewpoints on it. And then we're going to leave time at the end for questions. We want to do it that way so that all of you would really have a chance to share what you want to say. So we will absolutely be leaving time at the end for questions for all of you. So thank you for sharing your story. I think the next question I'd like to throw out is, the last 2 years has brought with it the pandemic, yes, of course, also national unrest, concerns about our climate, election stress. There's been a lot that's been thrown at us in 2 years. So would love to hear from you, your discussion around how do you think this has impacted mental health? How do you, in the work that you do, the communities that you see, what have you noticed about the impact?
Well, I'll start. Obviously, we were still pretty new into this conversation in construction before the pandemic. So, we still were, I guess, introduced. There are still people, I mean, there still are today, but there are still people who would never even consider this being a workplace topic, that were shocked, to hear the statistics of the industry. So one of the benefits that the pandemic brought was the more public discussion of mental health. It helped, I believe, to break down a little bit of those barriers. For, I think, workplaces in general, it enhanced the need of the workplace to be that place of stability, because there was so much instability going on in people's lives. And in construction, we had the benefit of being that place of stability, because for the most part, in most places in the country, I know not everywhere, but most places, construction was an essential function, and people got to keep working and got to keep going to work each day, even though that work may look different. There was different processes in place to make it happen. And so for a while, we almost, I guess, lost the moment of recognizing the need to focus on the impact of the pandemic on people's mental health, because we thought that we're still working. I get it for people that aren't working, but we're still all working. But what became apparent is the family stress that people were feeling, not to mention just kind of the unsettledness and the uncertainty that the entire thing brought, but recognizing that it may not just be that person in your workplace that needs help, but their families might need help. So whether it's their, children, like you referred to, Cheryl, or their spouses, maybe it's their spouse that's out of work. And so they are experiencing financial distress, even if they are still bringing home an income, or it's their kids that are at home, or it's playing this dual role suddenly of, the spouse that's working from home and trying to homeschool the kids, or all of those different. And so whether they themselves needed it because of all the extra stress that was being added on, in all these different roles, or being that conduit to them, being a support or providing support to a family member, I think it just really underscored the place of where we can be that constant in people's lives. And especially if somebody is in a place of distress or experiencing mental health, or, it may be the kind of the only place of that stability and that place where they can get resources. So I think it really underscored the need and helped, in our case and in our work, open people's eyes that had been kind of resistant to the need or the role of the workplace. It kind of opened their eyes to the role that they could play and the benefit that they could bring to their employees by providing this service.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, things really changed quickly, even in the construction area where many people got to keep going to work. Work was different, but then there were, thousands of people that were no longer working the same way they had been. I will tell you, the first week or two, people were pretty psyched. People were pretty happy. They weren't commuting. Life felt better. They could see their kids for dinner. There were lots of positive changes immediately, but then very quickly after that, it all switched. And I think it had a lot to do with people losing kind of their everyday framework of life. You know, you knew what time you had to get up. You knew how long it took you to get to work. You knew that, you know, at noon, somebody was going to walk by your office, ask you to go to lunch. It was time to stop working, get lunch, all of those things, even what time to come home. And then what happened? And those were all gone. And people were just in some ways floating. They didn't know, you know, whether they worked from 7 to 7 because there were no milestones to say, oh, it's time to stop. Or they were trying to work, but now they had their kids at home with them. It really, the level of stress and anxiety went through the roof, and people weren't sure how to deal with it, and then didn't have resources available because the available resources filled up very quickly and they didn't know where to turn. We saw so many people at home on the job who were in a house filled with people, yet what they were experiencing was isolation. They didn't know where to turn, what to do, how to manage that. And they couldn't quite put their finger on the fact that in a house full of people, they could feel isolated. So there was just a lot of dissonance on how people were feeling. And it was really hard. People were struggling right away, very, very strongly. That's some of the biggest changes that we saw.
Well, and then you layer on top of that concerns about our democracy, concerns about whether our children are losing time in their learning. And, you know, studies are showing that they are. Concerns about, you know, whether you can travel to see if you have loved ones, you know, abroad. Concerned about whether we're going to enter into a world war these days. Concerned about race and, you know, whether we're, you know, going to be going backwards in this country on those issues. I mean, there's something that touches every one of us. And, you know, it's hard to open a paper now without reading, you know, about, you know, mental health issues, you know, becoming more pronounced, and the shortage of therapists who can help those in need. But just anecdotally, you know, I have friends and family who say, I just feel anxious. What's that about? You know, life is fine, but why am I at a high level of anxiety? And fortunately, I've had experience with that, so I'm able to talk about it. But for those who haven't experienced that before, it's pretty scary. You don't know what's happening. And as I said, it's just, you know, there's a whole confluence of things that are going on in this city, state, and country and beyond that it's hard to imagine that someone is not affected by that.
Yeah. I think it's also as devastating as the pandemic and all the side effects of isolation, loneliness, everything, marriage dissolution, you know, kids learning in your bedroom. I think simultaneously we have witnessed a paradigm shift where people that I never dreamed of would come forward saying that they have struggles of any kind, let alone mental health struggles, which are so easily hidden when they're not scars on our body, right? They're all in our head. When these kinds of people come forward and say, hey, I am not good, I am having a hard time. I mean, I find that so inspiring, and as devastating as it is, proof that we're moving in the right direction, right? I mean, that's what I'm trying to do with my show, is just make mental health mainstream. And the only way to do that is to facilitate these discussions where people feel safe and almost commonplace to say that they are struggling. That is the only way to move the conversation forward. So with all of this devastation and atrocity, I do feel like there is a silver lining to the pandemic, at least that I've seen. You know, I mean, I get countless DMs a day from mostly men saying that they are having issues with mental health, and it is no longer, it doesn't have this gendered association anymore that I did find really profound in the past.
I think I completely agree. And I think bringing that conversation into the workplace is really important, because in their private lives, they may be willing to do that, kind of in the DMs, they're coming forward and they're at least identifying on their own that this is okay and I'm struggling.
Yeah.
I still think people have a hard time in the workplace. They worry about, if I somehow am identified as struggling, is that going to mean I'm not going to get a
Sure.
promotion?
For
Is
sure.
that right? And so how do we keep that conversation and keep that movement that you're talking about moving into the workplace? I think that's hard.
Starts from the top down for sure. I mean, the same way Diane was telling about her story. I mean,
Yeah.
what is more powerful than that? Receiving 1,000 letters because this woman in a position of incredible power is admittedly having mental struggles. I mean,
Yeah.
it's incredible. It's such a testament to the power of speaking out from the top down.
Right.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's
there's
huge.
there's still a, I'm sorry, Cheryl, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead.
But, there's still, is a fear, among individuals that, well, maybe you got through this, but, in your workplace, but it's not going to happen in mine. And,
Mhm.
I recently got a call from one of the young lawyers at the firm that I was with until recently, who said I just need to I need someone to talk to, and thankfully he reached out, and we had a good conversation, and I think I was able to help him and refer him elsewhere. But the worry is, especially when you're in a professional services kind of role and people are looking to you for your advice and expertise, they want someone who they know they can trust, who is stable, who is, can provide the best advice. And there's this fear, I think, that if I show a weakness in my own, in some, forget about the physical, but in my mental abilities,
Mhm.
who's going to trust me? Who's going to come to me for advice? And so, yeah, I think it really has to start, at a higher level, at the top, or people who have had some proven success, both sort of in the before and after, to show that this is not a career-ending issue. It can be if you don't deal with it, but if you do, life can be just as rich as it was the day before you sought help. And
Yeah.
indeed,
Yeah.
in many ways, for me, richer.
Yeah.
I call it creating caring cultures. That's like my big tagline that I promote, which I know can sound a little bit kind of vanilla, like kind of that sounds really great, but in construction, one of our advantages is our safety cultures. And so that's and that's kind of where we've had success in tying in attention to mental health. And just where I kind of marry it to is in an effective safety culture, it has to be top down and consistent. So there can't be these are all the rules, but when the boss shows up on the job site, he doesn't have his hard hat on, or he, is wearing his loafers, not his steel-toed boots, or, whatever it is. Like the culture has to be completely consistent all the way across the board. And there has to be a demonstration that if there is a safety incident, it's going to be handled with education, with information, with training, with correction, but not with punishment. Because as soon as you enter punishment into the equation, then that's when you're not going to get incidents reported, and they're going to get covered up, and they're going to get hidden. People aren't going to ask for help because they have a fear that if I ask for training on this, they're going to think I don't know it. And so therefore I'm going to get punished for it. Or I'm going to get blamed for, whatever happened. And so bringing that same attitude and approach and informing people how to do that with mental health, of creating that culture where, just like in a safety incident, they're not afraid to report it because they're not fearful of their job or their reputation. The same thing with a mental health concern, or, a concern, and again, for themselves or for somebody else. And that's the big of not just, our education has been in educating people on the warning signs to look for, so that they can feel empowered to help each other and have that peer-to-peer relationship, where there's less fear of the boss knowing about it. So kind of helping them bridge that gap on their own. And that's where, with the pandemic, kind of one of the entry points was with families experiencing stress and distress, of opening people's eyes to, okay, I don't think I have this problem, and I don't think any guy that I work with is going to ever have this problem. But
Mhm.
if I'm learning this to benefit my wife, or I'm learning this to benefit my kids, I'm going to be more open to it. And at the same, what they're learning is going to benefit, in the workplace as well. But yeah, that culture of, and that's kind of how, the advantage that we've had as an industry is having this safety culture mentality that's proven successful and improved our performance over the past several decades, that then we can kind of use as the same framework for building in this mental health attention, that it has to be top down, it has to be consistent, and it has to be with an attitude of care and help and wanting people to improve, not from a punishment condescending type of approach.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say to piggyback off this idea of starting from the top. I've also realized this on my show. I mean, that was the entire inspiration for inviting cultural icons onto the show. I mean, we had Tyra Banks on, and I'd get messages from a girl living in Nebraska that idolizes her, and she has an eating disorder, and learning that Tyra Banks also had an eating disorder and suffered from one, and this girl just idolizes her. She also felt less alone, right? She's like, we have to humanize our heroes. We have to humanize the people at the top, right? And struggle and success are not mutually exclusive. So when we have these figures at the top admitting or sharing or creating a safe environment for which people that work for them or, are not necessarily at the level at which they're at, feel safe coming out and be like, oh my God, I identify, me too. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than that, right? Because we do have this insidious comparative narrative in this culture. We're constantly comparing ourselves to those we admire. And that, for me and from my experience, absolutely needs to be broken down, because everyone's the same. We all struggle.
100%. I think it's generational, right? So a lot of the senior leaders are from an older generation, and they are not used to having that freedom and that ability to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to share that story. And you now have the newer generations coming in, and they've heard it in high school, they've heard it in college. They're living a different truth when it comes to that, and they're more used to seeing their icons who have admitted it, or a teacher, or the education that they've received. And so you get the clash of those two generations in the organization. And especially in this time of the Great Resignation, people are looking for an employer who cares. People are looking for someone who for a place of work where they can be seen for what they are and get the care and not worry about it. And so that education at the very tops of the organization is so important, to be able to open that conversation. They've got to lead by example, and helping the leadership in an organization understand that is hugely important to the overall success, I think.
And Cheryl, I think so much of what you're saying is just incredible. What I think is great about the younger workforce coming in, wanting to talk about this, is then if you have leadership, as you're all saying, and you're all role models in what you do, if you have leadership modeling that it's okay to talk about this from the top down, and then you have a young workforce coming in that's talking about it from the bottom up, if you will, then you really see that shift in the culture. So, Gigi, when you said earlier, you used the word epidemic, that you started to see there's an epidemic of this in your generation. It sounds like what we're really saying is we're normalizing it. So it's not an epidemic in the bad sense of the word, but this is something we experience. It's close to us. So how can we address it in a less pathologizing, less stigmatizing way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is actually an epidemic unless we deal with it. I mean, I don't know one person who doesn't struggle from mental health. Not a single one of my friends that I've talked to, male, female, trans, anyone. So I think it is, unless we talk about it.
So to throw another question out there. So you've talked a lot about what you see in your population. Anything else in terms of visibility, and anything around what's being missed in the communities that you hear from, Gigi and Diane, and the work that you do through your advocacy now, Michelle, Cheryl, the work that you do, what's being missed? What is visible? What needs to be more visible? And what are we missing?
Well, I don't do any research on this. I don't have any data that supports this except my own experience. But I think what has been missed in the past, but is now getting more attention, and I think it deserves much more attention, are the differences among different ethnic groups, different communities, different socioeconomic groups, about how you talk about mental health. You know, again, as I said, growing up in the Black community, you just didn't talk about that. That was sure to get you labeled as, a sissy. Forgive that term, but that's what, or, just weak. And I mean, I grew up in a household with a father who, you know, was quick to call people weak when they cried, for example. I mean, that's um, how hard it was to talk about a weakness. I think paying attention. I don't think this is a one size fits all kind of issue, and I do think some attention is being paid to this, but I do think it's important for us to understand the difference, the different types and levels of stigma in the community, and to the extent we have our experts out there working on how to erase those stigmas, how to talk about it, who should be talking about it. I think being mindful that different communities have different norms for dealing with mental health issues is going to be important. So I think that certainly has been missing. I'm not going to say it's missing now. I think there's more attention being paid to it.
That's a really great point. Just, kind of within our industry, one of the things we quickly realized is there's a large Hispanic population that works in construction, and the very different way that they talk about mental health and approach it from a cultural perspective. And so that's some of our resources at the beginning. We said we wanted to get translated into Spanish, and what we learned, the term we were given was transculturized into Spanish. So it's not just a direct translation word for word. It really has to be just completely approached from a different aspect within those different cultures. So yeah, that's a really key point that I think is still an issue and not well understood. So I think that's a great point, Ian.
Yeah, programs are not a one size fits all. You can't just offer something to a large group of people and not, in fact, take into account the cultural differences, the family differences, the different issues and concerns that people have. So you've got to be able to personalize. You've got to be able to provide the right support for the right people. Otherwise, I think you aren't just missing a whole population that whatever you're offering doesn't help because it doesn't apply to them. They don't see themselves in there. They can't relate to it. And so they will often turn away from it. So I think that individualized and personalized approaches are a lot of what's missing out there today.
Vic Armstrong this morning talked about, Diane, exactly what you were saying, that it was very powerful that in the Black community, what happens at home stays at home historically. You don't talk about it outside the family, and many cultures, I think, however you define culture, many cultures will be that way. I'm Indian South Asian, and I know we don't talk about depression, we don't talk about anxiety, you don't talk about that much that lays outside the medical realm. So if we move into then how do we, when we think about diversity, when we think about what we're saying about stigma, and moving into kind of the part of the conversation with, so what can we do to support individuals? What are actionable kinds of steps that we can begin thinking about to support individuals, to support teams, to support communities? Love to hear your thoughts on that, in addition to what you've raised.
I think establishing yourself as a safe person for someone to come to is everything. And that is something that everyone can do regardless of the size of their platform. I started with super few followers. No one knew I was talking about mental health. But the more I explained, said, showed in any way possible that I was a safe place, I'm down to talk to anyone, regardless of whether I know them or I don't, that has been the most meaningful part of this podcast. and of having that's the point of social media to me. And that is something that everyone can do. You will be shocked by the amount of people that come to you that need someone to talk to, especially the least likely person in your workspace that you think has it all together. They do not. And that has been the most transformative part of this entire journey for me. And I feel the same way about when other people establish themselves as a safe space, because I obviously don't have all my shit together and I need someone too. So yeah, I think that's the number one thing for me.
I think that's so powerful. I know that a leader in an organization can walk into a meeting, and if they're willing to say, you know what, I'm having a hard day. I'm struggling today. And so if I sound a little snappy, I'm owning it. I know it. And it's okay. Then what happens in that very next set of conversations is incredibly enlightening. And people are so much more willing to say, okay, if you can say it, I can say it. And then once someone says it, you can begin to provide them with that support. But you've got to break it somehow. And it's from the top, being willing to yourself be vulnerable. I love that.
Absolutely. And like, change the elevator talk. I remember towards the end of my time at Condé Nast, I just started, when someone asked me how I was, I'm like, oh my God, shit. I'm in a huge fight with my boyfriend. I don't know what to do. I'm really having a hard time today. And that person would come back to me with a story. She would retort with something similar or what they were going through. And then all of a sudden I connect with that person in my office that I have sat a cubicle over from for 4 years in a totally different way. So
yeah, giving people grace and space is what I call it, right? So I spend a lot of time in my organization letting people know, if you need to be with your family, you go do that. If this is important, if you need that mental health day, you need to take it. And I realized I wasn't doing it myself. So as soon as I started to talk about it and do it, their doing it felt less shameful and less, a cop out. They weren't performing the way they should. You literally have to do it yourself to really, even though you say it, if you don't do it, it doesn't matter.
And
Yeah.
all of what you've said is so right. And I'd love to see more of this in the lower ages in the schools. Having those conversations happen, in kindergarten and all the way up through, where it's okay to feel bad. It's okay to feel anxious. Let's find a way to help you, come out of how you're feeling or address it, or, you know, you're right. I mean, that elevator conversation or the conversation from the leader of a group in the conference room, really important. But how impactful would it be if, a third grader could say to one of her, buddies, are you feeling sad, or is it, can we talk about this? And and then you wouldn't have people like me, like Gigi, acknowledge that, that sit on this for 30 years, 40 years until it explodes. I'd love to see a greater push. And I know that your organization, Lisa, is doing a lot of that work, and others, I believe, right?
Yep. Yes,
In any
absolutely.
event, uh, you know, to me, if we could start small, start young, we might be a much better place in the next generation.
Well, I think,
Absolutely.
yeah, where that comes down to, kind of the note I had made on this topic was education and awareness. So it's giving people like mental health literacy. That's one of the tools that we encourage employers to start using, the language of feelings and emotions, and helping people even to identify it. Because that's the step. If they don't even know that this is really a thing that is okay to be feeling, or how to label it, how to identify it, how to talk about it. If they can't talk about it themselves, they're certainly not going to be able to, kind of talk about it with other people. And so giving them, mental health literacy, using the right words, and taking away some of the labels of, you're crazy, or, she's schizo, some of these phrases that are thrown around casually and in this negative way, but giving them the right words to use, the right phrases to use, so that it can be talked about and brought up. and that's one thing to do in the workplace, but like you said, if that starts at a younger age, then as people come into the workplace, it's a whole lot easier. And then I think, then helping people know what to do next. So it's those resources. And I think that's where, I think we're struggling as a nation with not having the sufficient resources. And so it's getting creative, and how do you be, and sometimes it's just like you said, Gigi, being that person that somebody can talk to, and that might be what they just need to be able to kind of dump on somebody and own their feelings and be validated, that their feelings are validated. But if they need more, what is that? So that's something that like we're trying to, look for models of, a lot of construction companies have moved to this model of having chaplains. So kind of people kind of on call that somebody can call and talk to that, they might not be licensed, therapists or, clinicians, but somebody that they can just talk to. So what's that next step, and how can we build out a framework for our communities so that they have, that next step to go to? Because it's great to kind of teach them to identify and know when they need help, but then if that help isn't there, to receive, that can be a challenge, and then, maybe create frustration. Well, I tried to get help, and that created other issues. So,
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to the peer-to-peer role that folks are, we talked about men earlier, and Gigi, you were saying that you hear from men that reach out to you. That peer-to-peer approach can be so effective. I know in construction, Michelle, there's a real movement for that. And being a clinician, I will tell you, a lot of people don't want to talk to a clinician. They want to reach out to you, Gigi. They don't want to reach out to me. So having people throughout the community that can engage in the conversation, which is what you're all saying, really equip folks to be able to talk about it more comfortably. And Diane, just want to mention what you were talking about in terms of starting in kindergarten. It is a sad but true fact that there's suicide risk in elementary school students. So what Diane was alluding to is that we have a signs of suicide program that's been around for 20 years in high school and middle schools. And we're now developing a version for elementary school students, 3rd through 5th grade, with Nationwide Children's Hospital. So specifically for that need. And with that comes a way to help teachers and parents feel more equipped to address this.
It's that conversation, Lisa, between parents, children, teachers, others in the community. I work with an organization called the I Am Strong Foundation, and we do something called Messages of Hope. And what it is, it's really kind of an arts and crafts day where we invite everybody in the community to come in, and they create cards to send to kids who are hospitalized, to let them know they're not alone, to let them know people are thinking about them. But what the beauty of the event really is watching different generations come together. We've had elementary school kids and grandparents in the same setting that don't know each other, sitting at the same table, talking about, maybe the grandmother is talking about their child who died by suicide years ago, and kind of, that it's okay to talk about struggles, and little kids asking about, what it means to be in the hospital, or why you would do a card, and just the organic nature of the conversation lets kids know at a very early age that it's normal to talk about this stuff, that it's normal to talk to your parents or to a friend. And that's the beauty of watching that come together, and the power that they bring to each other in opening up that conversation is, for me, it was really a really important moment, but I think it was for the people who participated as well. You've got to have those opportunities in the community somewhere to do that.
Absolutely.
I think that in order to normalize it for kids, and especially to piggyback off of what Michelle was saying about the verbiage and wording we use to talk about this, I mean, the word disorder means something is wrong with you. And disability, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, there was a room for kids with learning disabilities, and we would take tests. It was the disability room. And we'd take a test in a room that was different from the rest of my class. And I was in a school of, there were like 40 girls in my grade. So there were like 6 of us, and we were stupid, right? And we had disorders, we had disabilities. And I think that language is more detrimental than anything, because I've experienced it myself, and I don't know why it hasn't changed. I cannot figure it out, because that is so detrimental to one's self-confidence and growth. And I also think, to what Michelle was saying about, when you say when you use these mental struggles as adjectives, like, oh my God, the weather is so bipolar today. It's like, no, the weather is not bipolar. It is raining and now it is sunny. There's nothing bipolar about that. And I mean, the amount of OCD jokes that I still get from friends that know my story is unfathomable. I'll show up somewhere and someone will ask if I need the salt and pepper together instead of, spaced out at a table. And we'll ask, we'll say, oh, we'd love to have you over. Like, we need our house clean. We'll seriously say these kinds of things. And it never stops getting hurtful. And I think that the language around all of these struggles really has to change. And there has to be some education around this because it is hurtful. And that's why the shame is so pervasive.
Yeah.
Even something as simple as kind of the example I always use for people is instead of saying they're depressed, they have depression. Just like if somebody has cancer, you don't say they're cancer. It's like they have cancer.
Yeah,
they have depression. They're
totally.
experiencing anxiety.
Yes.
They're living with,
That's right.
bipolar, whatever it is. Take that person. That's not the only thing that is about that person. Like, they're more than just the struggle that they're dealing with.
100%.
And so that seems to help with, kind of when you associate with a different physical, like cancer or heart disease, something that people can relate to. That's been one of the biggest things that kind of, I can see light bulbs go off of, like, oh, I get it. I get how that's hurtful. And I get how even that changes. It just changes your frame of mind when you're talking about something.
There's a lot in the chat right now around this, you really struck a chord around language is powerful, and we absolutely need to change that.
100%.
So I want to make sure we have time because we've got a really active participative audience here. So I want to make sure we have some time for questions. A couple more things I'd love for you to ask of you. So much you've already addressed. If you were to want to leave, I have two more questions. The first is, if you'd want to leave everyone with what they could do, what they could go out and do in their work, in their communities, because it's often easy to leave these conversations feeling inspired, and then it's hard to know, what do I do next? So if you could each speak to that, it would be fantastic.
If you are not okay, say you're not okay. The more vulnerable you are, you allow other people to be vulnerable too. And it creates a working environment that you cannot imagine, because I've created this in my team of 7, which is not many, but my team of 7 who work on my podcast. And granted, it is a mental health podcast, but still, if I'm not happy, I do not pretend to be happy. I say, I'm going through this. This is the support that I need. And it is absolutely transformative. So be that person in the elevator that doesn't say good in you, if you are not.
And to piggyback onto that, because I love the authenticity piece, and try to live that. But the other is reaching out to someone who you think might be struggling, and be willing to don't be afraid to bring up the topic. I think so many people shy away if they think someone's struggling and don't approach them. We laugh about, the casserole committee, when someone has somebody out sick and you rush over to bring meals when they break their arm or they've hurt their leg, or you think that they're ill. But if they are struggling, if they're out because of mental health issues, or their child has mental health issues and is seeking treatment and getting support, don't be afraid to ask how their child is. Don't be afraid to say, what can I do to help you? Because I think so many times we stigmatize it in that way. We don't approach because we're afraid they'll be embarrassed. You wouldn't be if the kid had their appendix out. Think about it the same way.
One of the articles that kind of was a real Kickstarter for a lot of these conversations in construction was There Will Be No Casseroles Tonight. And it was about a person who his wife had cancer, and like they almost couldn't keep up with the stream of food and help and everything else. And then their son attempted suicide and was hospitalized, and literally they heard nothing from anybody. And so that was just kind of that real similar.
I think that's a powerful story, Michelle. Yeah. I think one of the things that I have tried to practice doing is being just being an active and good listener. Don't ask somebody how they are if you don't really want to know how they are. And if, they say, okay, ask, well, that doesn't sound okay. What's going on? And then be truly interested in listening. So many of us just go through life. How are you doing? I'm fine. But you don't really, sometimes you don't even hear the answer because it's just a formality. I think, it's a variation of what everyone else just said, start listening and being an active and caring listener. Because I think sometimes that's half the battle, that somebody is listening to me. I can tell somebody this. And anyway, as I said, I try to do that in, my everyday life. I really do.
From a workplace perspective, I would say the kind of one thing to start doing is look for places that you have opportunities to build in this information and this communication and this awareness to people. And so, so many places, workplaces, and this, Cheryl, this is just right in line with what you do, but have, wellness programs, and they are focused on, your blood pressure and stopping smoking and all of these things, but they're not using that advantage to look at, your mental wellness as well. So in construction, with all the safety stuff. So our big movement has been like total human health or total worker safety. So recognizing that it's not just the physical safety that's important, it's the emotional safety. So looking for those built-in areas in the workplace. So it's not a whole separate thing that feels kind of weird or foreign or new, but what are the current programs, opportunity, where can you build in the mental health component of taking care of your workforce as well. And then, kind of an example, that I give people is, when you talk about wellness programs and things and different screening. So, a plug for MindWise and the screening tools that you have, that's such a great way to introduce people to how to even start looking and considering, is this something that I'm experiencing? And it goes right away, you have no problem having people, check their blood pressure and, check their blood sugar and all of these different biometric checks that we do. And so building that mental health screening in as well, I think is kind of one of those easy tools that's there, it's available. And then it not only increases their awareness of it in themselves, but it gives them those tools of things to start looking for to help in other people. And it also helps with the language because it's helping teach them the proper language to start using to talk about these things. So, just those opportunities to provide that help and start that conversation wherever possible.
That's so brilliant. I mean, imagine if you went for your annual or semi-annual physical and your doctor said, how's your mental health? What a conversation that could spark, and what, the kind of help and support someone would have. I mean, in recent years, some clinicians are asking about, whether you feel safe at home. I mean, with the whole domestic violence, campaigns, it has become a question that clinicians ask, women at least. Wouldn't it be terrific if your physician asked you how you're feeling emotionally, mentally? It's part of the whole self. Why not?
Right. Whole self is important. Looking at physical and mental health equals total health is a big message to get to people.
So these action steps are, they're profound in how simple they are in a sense, how we can really do them every day. It's get real. I love the change the elevator talk analogy, Gigi. It's listening, it's reaching out if you're worried about somebody, know where you can build programs. And I'm paying attention to the chat because there are great comments and ideas coming in. So I want to ask one more thing before we open it up for the Q&A. And that is, as I'm listening to all of you who are incredibly busy and incredibly accomplished, how do you take care of yourselves kind of on a daily basis? I ask that because as we work with leadership and organizations, there is an increasing focus on thinking about how are leaders taking care of themselves. So would love to hear about that.
That's a great question. because it's so easy to understand and to share with others. It's so much harder to do it for yourself. And I think for me, and it's a newer choice, is to draw boundaries of kind of what's my time. When can I shut off and do the things that bring me joy and that help bring me down and kind of recenter. And it was really hard to draw boundaries because everybody else needed something. And I was spending a lot of time doing what everybody else needed and realized I was burning it on both ends. So it's boundaries. It's really drawing those boundaries and paying attention to that, for me anyway.
That's exactly my answer, Cheryl. Finding time, and I didn't come to it myself. I have a wonderful therapist who said, you've got to find your time. It's so clear that when your life is crowded with helping everybody else and filling everybody else's expectations of you, that's when you're at your worst. You need to carve out time and intentionally carve it out. No, I can't do this because it's my time. You don't have to offer any excuse. I'm going to be doing my laundry or whatever. It's my time. So that is how I've learned to keep things in balance.
It takes practice, as I've learned.
It takes a lot of practice and resolve.
Yeah.
My secretary posted a sign on my bulletin board in my office once. It says, no is a complete sentence. It does not require explanation. And it's what I lived with, because she said, you never say no. You got to say no.
I love that.
Yep.
I think it would be interesting. It's interesting that this is a group of women. I think it would be interesting to have a male perspective, because I think one of the comments was something about mom. And I think that's just as women, we naturally, fill that kind of nurturer role. And, kind of along with what you're saying, that old adage of like in the airplane, like you have to put your oxygen mask on first in order to help other people put their oxygen mask on. But yeah, it's definitely easier said than done. So that space and that prioritizing. So that, keeping what's important to you and not letting that be sacrificed at the expense of getting a bunch of things done. So, for me, that's always physical activity. And so, and to the point where I can be as open about that if I'm not getting that, I'm not a happy person. And so people will even kind of joke about if I am having a bad day of like, did you make it to the gym this morning? And so, but being vulnerable and open enough to go like, yeah, I'm not a good person if I don't have that element in my life. And so, and I think that helps allow other people then to go, okay, it is okay to have other, feed myself in ways that are important to me.
Oh, Gigi,
Are you
you're
on
on
mute?
mute.
Sorry. No, I love everything that everyone has said. I think rituals and routines are really important as well. And more important, not punishing yourself if you do skip a day. You can always return to it and forgive yourself and know that we are all imperfect, as such as the human condition. But I think what's also important is what I have found personally is the work doesn't stop. I thought after McLean, 3 months of therapy, left my job, deleted social media, broke up with my boyfriend, I was like, I'm a new person, I'm fixed. And the work keeps going. I mean, yeah. I am always exploring different types of therapy, different types of meditation. It is a full-time job to take care of yourself, at least myself. And I recently tried psychedelic therapy for the first time, which was something that I was really scared to do. And the more I did research on it over a course of 2.5 years, the more I thought that this could be a fit for me. And that's my next thing. I've just discovered psychedelic therapy. And the point here is that you always have to keep pushing yourself if you feel that you want to reach new boundaries, or rather go through boundaries, push through your boundaries and reach new insights to yourself. The work really doesn't stop. There is no end, but that's a beautiful thing. I think there's no end to self-discovery and exploration.
Absolutely. And growth, and putting it in the context of growth. we're all evolving. So I do want to open it up for Q&A. So we've got some great tech support. I think, Nick, do we have Q&A questions as well as chat questions? Just want to open it up.
Yeah, we have one question from the Q&A, and then actually there's a bunch of questions that are in the chat that I can pull out if we don't get more of them from the Q&A. It's a long one. I'm going to read it aloud for y'all. I've worked as a leader in companies where HR isn't truly private. There were a lot of off the books conversations where leadership was given information that they shouldn't have gotten for company liability protection, especially around mental health issues. Any realistic advice for people who fear this when asking for help? Please don't have realistic time. People don't have realistic time and resources to sue them because they can't do that.
I mean, I'll start on this one.
Yeah.
Just because one of the common, I mean, I've kind of had this more from the opposite side of employers stating they don't want to bring this into the workplace because they feel like they're going to be at increased liability for, you know, providing accommodations if they're aware now that somebody has a mental health condition or something like that. And the answer to that is that you're going to be at a much greater liability if something happens to this person while they're at work because of, you know, they didn't get the help that they needed, or like in construction, if an accident occurs or something because they didn't get the help that they needed. But also, what are you doing as a, you know, if you know about something but you're kind of ignoring it, and then you the performance issues start to arise because of it, and then you start to punish the performance issues, and all along you're ignoring kind of the root cause, you're really setting yourself up for a bigger issue from that. So that's more the question that I normally get is, as employers, is this really a smart thing to take on from employers? So I guess the key would be, you know, don't certainly if you're doing this where you know it's becoming gossip or being shared outside of the framework. And I think this is just where it comes down to leadership and leadership building that trust in people, that issues that are presented, regardless of what they are, whether they're mental health or they're, you know, you've got a family issue going on, or you've got a physical health condition, you know, whatever it is, that they're going to be treated confidentially and only in the way that the employee gives permission for them to be, you know, shared and handled, and that the employee is involved in the kind of plan for what happens and what occurs. So that real, just kind of that culture of trust, I think is just fundamental for any of this to work.
Yeah, people, if they don't have trust and confidence in their HR, won't reach out to get help, which puts everybody at greater risk. But being able to provide potentially a program that's run by a third party that is there to support person, taking that burden off of HR and providing that sense of anonymity, and the ability to keep that privacy, but still provide the support is important. And that's something that we've seen in a lot of companies that allow people to get help, but don't, one, burden HR, and two, don't create that risk of confidentiality spilling, because I think people won't come forward for that.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is from Katie, and she says, how do we strike a balance between opening the conversation of addressing mental health needs overall while protecting the needs of those struggling with debilitating mental health disabilities?
Great question. I think, again, it's having the conversation that normalizes it, but providing those confidential resources that make it available for people to get the kind of support that they need. That's the only way I can think of is you have to normalize the conversation, but you have to give people a private outlet. You have to give them a place to go where, I'm going to use Michelle's word for a second, they feel safe, that they know that they can trust the resources they're getting. That's all I can think. Does anybody else have?
I think it does come down, I would add that it's so much about culture. So there's a difference between having a culture where you can talk openly and respectfully about mental health. That's different than somebody has a right to not disclose whether they're struggling with a mental health issue. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be talking about it or it gets into privacy issues. It's more having the type of environment where if somebody wants to share, that they're struggling, that there's an openness and there's support around it.
Yeah.
And then I think just to kind of reinforce the topic of language and having the correct vocabulary surrounding this and know how to talk properly about it so that you don't, the conversations that are taking place don't become damaging or hurtful to a person who may be living with a mental illness. Like Gigi said, the people who say really insensitive things, to her, you don't want a program that's intended for good and building awareness to unintentionally hurt people who may already be living with those conditions.
It's a culture of respect.
It causes me to, amend something I said earlier when I said, I like to be an active listener, and to say, well, it doesn't sound like you're okay. That could intrude upon someone's, need for privacy. And maybe the real way to say it is something you want to talk about. So that there is that respect. It's one recognizing that someone may have an issue and may welcome someone to talk about, but also not pushing someone into a conversation that they don't want to have. So that question just educated me. Thank you for whoever asked it.
Excellent. All right, let's keep going. A question just came through in the chat from Lynn. What do you do about leadership who doesn't seem to take a threat seriously against staff?
Wow.
I'm not sure. So there's a couple ways you could take that. So I'm wondering, Lynn, if there was more to that. A threat seriously. So someone on the staff is feeling threatened, or they're threatening I'm not sure which direction that is. Doesn't take.
Let's give Lynn a second to follow up on that. And I'm going to go ahead and give you all another question. Someone earlier, when we were having the conversation about authenticity and sort of being sort of your authentic self all the time, someone asked, how do you respond when in response to that, you're told, oh, that's the person who complains and is so negative all the time?
Yeah, I don't think you have to, you do it in a way that feels good to you, I hear you on that completely, but I think that, there are times that you also feel like sharing, and you won't feel like sharing with everyone, if there's someone, there's no responsibility to share either, right? It's totally intuitive. So if you're in the elevator with someone and you don't want to share with them, you do not have to. There is no responsibility you have, right? You share what you want to and what feels good to you. So I think you kind of take that in stride. You share with people that you trust. Somehow you have a good intuition about them and how they'll receive your information and what they'll give back and if they'll hold space for you. And if not, then you don't. I think there's definitely an intuitive component to what you share, when you share, and who you share with. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
That was great. Thanks, Gigi. I have not seen any clarification from Lynn, and I'm combing through the chat. I think that's all the questions I see so far. If anyone wants to throw anything into the Q&A, we have a little more time.
Yeah, to what we have from Lynn's question, and then even going back to the first, question that was in the chat, if there's a real issue with leadership and how they're handling these things, I think it's probably a good evaluation of the organization that you're a part of. And if those issues are brought up to them with a sense of respect and a desire to try to improve the organization, and there's no response. Again, somebody brought up the Great Resignation earlier. I think that's a lot what's creating these is right now we're living in a world where people really can choose where they work. And again, another spinoff from the pandemic, people are have learned really what's important to them and that they can deal with change and still be okay. And so this is where I think a lot of workplaces are going to start maybe suffering the consequences of bad leadership because people are just not going to settle for it anymore. So I think it's a real moment for leaders to take that self-evaluation. And if you're in a role where you can influence leadership or bring them feedback, I think that's really an important thing to do, because having a safe workplace and a healthy workplace is becoming more and more important to people.
Yeah.
I have a question actually for Diane.
Sure.
I after you received these 1,000 letters, did you undergo any sort of transformation or way that you showed up in the world?
Yes, yes is the answer. What I got from that is a sense, one, that I wasn't alone.
Mhm.
Two, that there were, well, I'm saying this in a different way, but there were so many other people out there. Three, that it gave me a strength that I didn't know I had to continue to go out and talk about this. And it made me feel as though I had a responsibility to be an advocate when and where I could. I came away from that whole experience feeling so strong. And there were times, I mean, it's past now, but there were times I had to pinch myself because I came from this low sense of, weakness and futility to a place where I felt strong and able, and where I could make a difference. So yeah, it was very transforming to me. And those letters were very helpful. I got prayer cloths that people made for me. I got things that kindergarten classes, little cards that a teacher had their kids, write to me. I mean, it was really so reinforcing that I was okay. And it made me want to make sure that people who are experiencing what I went through also know that they're okay.
So
I've got a few more questions if y'all are still good to go. This one is from Rachel. I can't help but notice that the leaders here are all women, yet most leaders across society are men. What are your thoughts about how to bridge this reality?
It's interesting, when we put this panel together, that was not intentional. We happened to reach out to folks we knew were leaders and that we were connected to, and this is what evolved. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think leaders can be, I don't think leader has to be the president or the CEO. I think that everybody has the capacity to be a leader in their organization. And as long as that leader is an advocate or a support for, addressing their total worker wellness in the workplace, it's okay if somebody, and at least there'll be a vocal support, but maybe they don't have to be the person kind of leading the initiative. And so I think it's pretty common that there are, that women are just more naturally inclined, it seems, to kind of address these topics with people and be more inclined to kind of be that relational person. And so, like, in construction, for example, that's kind of one of the things, is there aren't a lot of women in construction. And so is that part of our problem? And if we had more women that were regularly involved in interfacing with the workforce, could this be addressed via that? So obviously we want all leaders and the entire population, male and female, to want to put a priority on mental health. But I don't think it necessarily has to be the person at the top being the one, to kind of flush it out and act it out, as long as they're empowering somebody, male or female, to do that and setting the tone for the organization to support these initiatives.
It's really well said.
I did
Awesome,
notice
thank
that.
you. Oh,
I'm sorry. All I was going to say is I did notice that Lynn had put more
Yes.
information into the chat, and I really hope that we could address that before the end.
Yes.
I think
do you want to jump in and do that right now, sir? Go for it.
Yeah, I want just my perspective of it, both as a CEO and a leader in an organization, also working with many organizations and supporting them surrounding the mental health of their employees. Every threat, every concern like that needs to be taken seriously, and as if it is an actual threat. I think, that it needs to be escalated, it needs to be investigated, and that person needs to be addressed. So I don't think it's okay to just say, oh, just to be aware, but that there needs to be action taken, and whether it's a conversation, whether it's getting that person support or help. But workplace safety is important for everybody. And I think it's also the culture of language, right? That you don't joke about, oh yeah, this is what I'm going to do if, that even if you think you are joking about it, that someone acts and approaches you and deals with that issue. I think it's serious and it needs to be dealt with directly.
And if I understood Lynn's question, it sounds like there was a threat made in leadership. Lynn, if I'm correct, that your leadership didn't respond in a way of taking such a strong threat seriously. That would also make me wonder about if leadership is overwhelmed, what's getting in the way of leadership being able to acknowledge that this is a huge safety risk. So to also think about what needs to happen there, what shift needs to happen.
Right. And
Well,
whether
depending on the organization, there are, alternate, sources to go to. Maybe there's an ombudsperson. I mean, those are large organizations. Maybe there's a board, that, oversees leadership. But I have to tell you, a threat that isn't taken seriously, if there aren't any other resource, I'd tell you, I'd go outside. I'd go to my local police department. I mean, that's not something you fool around with.
right.
It's a shame, if a workplace has leadership that ignores those kinds of threats and just says, oh, don't pay attention to him, he's crazy, that sort of thing. I don't think you can do that. And
Right.
And I would go outside.
Agree.
Thank you all. These are great answers. A couple more questions we can try to squeeze in here. Do you have any resources you'd recommend about managing this as leaders in workplaces? It's a pretty broad one, so.
I mean, for construction, we have a tool that I think is applicable to probably a lot of workplaces. Some things are going to not be applicable, but on our website, which is preventconstructionsuicide.com, there's a needs analysis and integration checklist. So it kind of asks you questions to kind of go through and see, are we talking about addressing these issues in the workplace? And then some steps that if you're not, that you can take to kind of start doing those. So again, it's construction specific, but I would say 90% of it is probably applicable to workplaces broadly. I can drop that web address in the chat if you'd like.
I smiled because I was thinking about our partnership with Mindwise and what we've done to evaluate, what's needed in the workplace and what programs are available. And I think, not to plug you all, but Mindwise is a great resource and has lots of ideas about what can be done and how to think about your environment. We are one of many programs, but there are so many things that you can look at.
Great. Let's see a couple more here. Just going back to our conversation earlier about peer support. I found this in the chat. I wanted to circle back to it. Someone had commented that we're seeing that peer support is one of the most effective treatment interventions, but how do we start it earlier? I know we kind of touched on some of this, but I thought I'd circle back to it.
Well, not to, as you say, Cheryl, plug Mindwise, but, you all have, if we could expand the programs that you have to bring them into the schools. I mean, I think that's the way. I think there's, if you can get to the Boston Public Schools, for instance, and try to introduce it in the curriculum. And I don't know exactly how you're sort of exporting that program, but I think that's how to do it. You've got the tools. The question is, whether we have the interest in people using those tools.
And we peer-to-peer, thank you, Diane. So there's peer-to-peer in the school, that approach with students for suicide prevention. There's also peer-to-peer that our trauma team does a lot of with first responders, with police. So there's a lot of ways that, and in terms of getting it started, it is working with folks that have expertise in that and getting those conversations going and doing those trainings. Because the idea is that it's a bit of a train the trainer. Once you build that peer support within your organization, then you could step away and it can continue and sustain itself.
But I think having someone train those people is important. You don't want to create that network without people having some sense of how to manage and support others. and what to do again when they become potentially overwhelmed. How do they get the support they need?
That's right. So we have a minute. I want to thank you all four of you. This has been so thought-provoking and just fantastic. So thank you all for participating. Thanks for everyone that participated, that joined us today. Really wonderful comments, questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you for
so
having
much.
Take care,
us.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Just so we know, we going to have a quick break now before our last session starts promptly at 2:15 Eastern Standard Time. Before you leave this room, please copy the Zoom link from the chat box. I'm going to drop it in there in just a moment, and use it at 2:15 for our keynote from Dr. Rory O'Connor.
Thanks, everyone.